It becomes to the point because now their whole idea of what a crisis is way different. You know, it's true even just in different cultures. Like, you know, I grew up mostly in really bad, violent neighborhoods, and I remember going to rich neighborhoods every now and then, and, you know, the kids there were very different, you know, and their idea of getting into a fight was maybe pushing each other. I came from a neighborhood where, you know, with my instincts immediately, like, someone's going to get shot, you know, somebody's going to get shot because of this. I'm getting out of here because, you know, and of course it never happened because we're talking about the burbs here, but I realized that those kids would never understand where I was coming from trying to explain that, you know, that they've never been in that situation. It was funny because I made friends in that other culture and then brought them back with me, and they lived with me and my mom for a while. So they got to see their first drug bust when the SWAT team showed up at my neighbor's house and bust down the door and throws the flashbangs, and, you know, they're all glued to the frickin' window like they're watching an action film, and I was just sitting there playing Sega Genesis like it was no big deal because they've only done it 20 other times at the other time that I lived there. You know, it was such a different attitude, and this is important to activists to understand the stuff that you're talking about, you know, is the camaraderie. It's also a note that it's like you can't even, until somebody's been in that situation, you can't communicate with them in the same way. The same associations don't come up. I mean, I didn't even realize how unusual my life was until one day I was sitting there with a friend of mine, and we were watching the movie Last of the Mohicans, if I remember correctly. And it's late one night, and he was from like Farmington Hills or some really rich neighborhood, and, you know, we had met by chance playing laser tag, I think. He comes over to my house, and, you know, and we're sitting there watching that movie, and, you know, I hear brrr, you know, just automatic weapon fire, probably block away. I don't even flinch. And he's like, holy, you know, just jumps up and is like scared out of his gourd. And I'm just like, I was like, oh, what's up? He's like, what the hell was that? I was like, it sounded like an AK-47. You know? He's like, does that happen often? I'm like, yeah. And I just go back to watching the movie because I'm used to that. He's not. And I eventually adjusted to it, but that's, you know, when I went into that world, it was hard to communicate to people, to me, what a violent situation is. You know, it was hard to communicate to them, you know, where I was coming from because they just never understood it, never interpreted it. And that's why, you know, Jacques Fresco talks about this. When you're trying to reach someone and trying to teach them or make them aware of something, you have to appeal to their values. You have to try to see them from their perspective. That's what I was trying to say when I provided that information about that police officer, for example. Police are nervous when they pull you over because that's where most cops get shot. You know, it doesn't justify the fact that the cop is pulling you over for BS laws. It doesn't justify, you know, what happens if the cop decides to be, you know, violent or whatever. But again, root causes. You know, that's the issue that, you know, I think people, particularly activists, if they're going to reach out to these soldiers, if they're going to reach out to, you know, the police, which is what's going to be needed someday, then they're going to have to be able to understand that these people are alien. You're dealing with a different kind of human being at that point. Whether they were brainwashed to be that way or whether the things that they saw have changed their ability to interact with other human beings, they're different. You know, they're still, however, human beings who do have feelings, who have a value, you know, and in the many ways, there is, in my opinion, no greater victim of the system than a police officer who has been conditioned enough to believe that macing 6 innocent girls is an acceptable behavior. We can hate the police officer, but you should really think to yourself what you would feel like if you ever did something like that. And then imagine that, you know, let's put a little bit of fiction into it. Let's say that somebody took over your body and forced you to mace 6 children, you know. Then imagine that somebody, say, I don't know, let's give you an example, an alien or whatever possessed you, took you over, made you think differently, and made you do that. That's a nightmare, you know, and that's essentially what has happened to these people. And what's worse is, like, you know, unlike Invasion of the Body Snatchers, these people still believe that it's them that's doing that. It doesn't occur to them that, you know, I've been in some way conditioned to believe that this is acceptable behavior. Those people are the biggest victims of the system in so many ways, because if I'm an atheist, but if I were to say I believed in a soul, those people have had their souls taken from them, you know, in a way that is never going to get fixed. You know, the same thing is true of soldiers who get sent over and get mentally broken by the things that they were made to do. Those are perhaps the biggest victims of the world. You know, in so many ways, victims of the system. And that's why I tell people, activists and things, because, you know, like when I said I was going to do a show about this, it was very controversial. There were a lot of people complaining about it, actually. And I said, look, just shut up and hear us out, because there's a point to be made here. Because the same reasons that you hate the system, you know, the innocent victims and the human beings and all that are the same. You know, these are still human beings. And any human being who has found themselves to the point that they are essentially corrupted enough to the point that they have lost their ability to perceive that what they are doing is wrong, you know, it's kind of like this. I'd rather get shot by a Klingon in Star Trek than become a Borg.
Now that's a little over my head.
I agree. I agree with you, and I think that the way that you're presenting that information is probably the best, you know, way to, you know, potentially solve this. You know, it's like Mike says. You know, he's big Gandhi. You know, he believes in what Gandhi did. You know, I think that, you know, you're on the right track as far as, you know, if you were to communicate with somebody and try in an attempt to try to make a change. But at the same time, I also feel like, you know, whose fault is it then? You know, I mean, do we say that, you know, it's all the system or whatever, it's all of its fault, or is it the police officer? Is it the police officer's fault who did that? Well, for not having the self-awareness and just the consciousness or the integrity to, you know, reflect upon yourself to say, no, this doesn't sound right to me. You know.
Let me jump in here, because I'll say it's like this. You know, if you're working with a giant machine full of gears, and you stick your hand in the machine, and you get your hand caught in the gear, whose fault is it? It's yours. Mm-hmm. And so the thing is you either gotta, you know, see the situation and say, you know what, I need to put a guard over this place where the gears, where I can stick my hand in and solve that problem, you know, because I know it's going to be a problem.
Right.
You know, and I think that's kind of the same thing with this. You know, at the end of that blog that I have, there's a little like 4-minute video of a guy that was like the head of the KKK, and he's talking about harassing a black preacher. And, you know, they did different things. They tried to burn down his church. They called him on his phone and they threatened him. They burned a cross in front of his house. And, you know, the response that he got from the preacher, the black preacher, is effectively the same response that solves this problem. It's not to be afraid. You know, it's to basically understand that, you know, the other side, you know, like, and I think it's probably the most information you can get out of a 4-minute video, you know, because it's basically explaining how it works. And, you know, this, like I said, they you know, burned a cross across from his house. The preacher comes out and he says, guys, you want some hot dogs and marshmallows for your fire? You know, he basically, you know, totally decimates, you know, their idea is to terrorize him, and his idea is to make fun, you know.
Kill them with kindness.
Yeah, and the whole thing is that's the kind of you know, of way to kind of, you know, diffuse the situation in a thinking way that actually resolves, that actually gets people to think, you know.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I think that, you know, taking it and looking at it from that perspective, you know, is probably the way to solve the problem. You know, I agree with that.
You know, an interesting experience that comes to mind, talking about protesters again, when I had Danny Shine, formerly of the Love Police. I don't know if you guys are familiar.
Yeah.
During the course of the protest against the royals, like the royal wedding and all the money being spent on it, you know, they just basically grabbed Charlie Veitch and they just took him to jail before the thing even started, because they knew he was going to be an issue. Danny is a little bit less known, And so he walked up to the police that were there holding people back from the barrier, and he related to them, was very friendly with them, talked to them, got through to them, and then eventually they let him beyond the barrier. And they let him, with his megaphone, without giving him any trouble at all, walk up and down the barrier and protest there and talk to the people. And he did that essentially through these communication skills of kill them with kindness. It was so evident that he wasn't there to hurt anybody, that he wasn't going to create any problems, that he therefore in turn got to become even more effective as a protester because of what it is that he was doing and how he managed to convince those people, hey, I'm just here and this is what's going on. And when you probably think about it, if you talk to some of these people, they probably think the royal wedding's a big, bunch of bollocks too, to use some British terms. So if you can get through to them, then you'd be treated differently. If you go in there and you start spitting in the cop's face, like, screw you, you're upholding the royals and all that, well, you're not going to get very far. Not only are you not, it kind of comes back to that same thing I was, in that radio show I did about that Stack guy driving his plane into the side of a building. I read the letter that he wrote on the air, and I said, and unfortunately, because this guy flew a plane into a building after writing this, everything in here is now discredited. Everything this guy wrote, even though it's absolutely true, is now discredited. And if anybody ever tries to talk like this again, they'll be like, uh-oh, aren't you, you're like that crazy guy who flew a plane into the side of a building. Good job. I get that you're upset. I understand that, but you have now essentially held us back quite a bit. It's, and fortunately enough, that issue kind of fell out to the wayside, and that the issue of the bank's corruption is enough, mainstream, thanks to people like Ron Paul, that it didn't get buried. But at the end of the day, a guy flying into the side of an IRS building, killing himself and a bunch of other people, and then writing a bunch of stuff that's the truth, it got attention to it to some degree, but on the same token, now it's easier for anybody who wants to discredit that information to just call somebody who talks like that crazy. Now, go ahead.
Well, there was another thing that I wanted to mention, and that was, along the lines of that Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street thing. Dylan Ratican from MSNBC was down there, and there was a couple interviews with him kind of as he was leaving, and he expressed a lot of the same kind of that we've got an opportunity to really go to another level, like what Einstein said, you're a problem. To solve a problem, you have to go to the next level of, I'm not sure what the word was that he used, but the next level up as far as your mental ability or your understanding. The problem that we have can't be solved until we actually approach it from that direction,
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the same thing, if you look at like Star Wars and the Jedis, and you like Obi-Wan Kenobi when he basically comes up to a stormtrooper and he says, we're not a problem, let us through, or something like that. He's basically just kind of screwing with their mind, using the Force or whatever, and they go, oh, no, he's not a problem, let him through, But it's it's that kind of power that we have if we just understand, if we take the time to understand, what people are all about, and that's kind of the same thing. It's not necessarily as quick as what Obi-Wan portrays, but the fact of the matter is we have the ability that when we communicate with people, that we don't just present, the problem that we've got, but we actually listen to them for a second and possibly understand what motivates them or what's important to them, to the point that we can use that to our own benefit, to further the cause. Right.
Anything to add, Jake?
No, I think you said it good.
Well, excellent. It's been a great show having you guys on. I know you were talking about the possibility of restarting your show. Do you have any updates on that, or?